Hello, everybody. A very happy morning to you all. The Breakthrough Science Society, Kerala chapter, is conducting this webinar. A brief history of exoplanets from their discovery to present. And today we have a very eminent speaker, Dr. Manoj Puravankara. He is an associate professor of the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. Before we continue, let me introduce about the Breakthrough Science Society. Breakthrough Science Society was formed in 1995. It is a platform for creating science movement all over the country. This is a non-profit organization, social welfare organization, which works for the society and also a registered one. So the aim of Breakthrough Science Society is to cultivate scientific temper among the general public, along with the students and the teaching faculty. So we are working against unscientific beliefs, superstitions, fanaticism, communalism, and casteism. And our main aim is to popularize science and reach the advancements of science to the general public. We also cultivate the study of history and philosophy of science. Along with that, we highlight the importance of ethical values in science and to be more responsible, socially responsible citizens. So we also react to all issues of the society related with science. When the governments take decisions, we respond to it. If it is good, we appreciate, and if it is unscientific, we react to it strongly. So that is the movement of Breakthrough Science Society. In fact, this organization is there in almost all the states of this country, more than 20 states to be exactly. And we work for science, for the development of science. Along with that, to build scientific temper, which is the most important one. I welcome you all once again. Let me introduce Dr. Reshmi, who is an associate professor of the Earth and Space Science, Indian Institute of Space Science and Technology, Trivandrum, to introduce the speaker. Over to you, madam.
Thank you, Dr. Srikumaran. It's a great pleasure to have Professor Manoj Puravankara from the Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics, the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai, with us today. Manoj did his PhD from the Indian Institute of Astrophysics in Bengaluru and spent several years as a postdoctoral researcher across the world before joining the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. He was a research associate at the University of Rochester in the New York State. And he worked in the Academia Sinica Institute, Taipei, and at the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics in Pune. Manoj's research interests are in the area of star and planet formation. He uses state-of-the-art infrared facilities to trace birthplaces of stars and planets in our galaxy. He's a member of several large collaborations working with the Spitzer and the Herschel infrared space telescopes. Today, Manoj will talk to us about the history of exoplanet research, one of the most exciting areas of modern astronomy. In addition to doing the science, Manoj strongly believes in people science movements and is actively involved in taking science to people. He writes popular science articles in regional languages and in English. He is also engaged in activities to make the scientific profession more equitable. In fact, Manoj is a friend of mine, and we have had several enlightening discussions on these topics. We have been having it for several years. I'm personally also I'm very happy to have you, Manoj, here talking to a bunch of science enthusiasts and particularly young audience on the platform of the Breakthrough Science Society. Manoj, a very warm welcome to you. The stage is yours.
Thank you, Reshmi. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Um, Let me first share my screen before I thank the organizers. Can you all see my screen now?
Yes.
In the full screen mode?
Yeah, it's in full screen. It's visible.
Okay, excellent. Thanks, Reshmi, once again for that kind introduction. And also thanks to Rajivan, Shaji, and Sri Kumaran, and the Breakthrough Science Society for this opportunity to give this talk today. I'm really happy to be here. I'm really happy to be here talking to you about some of the latest developments in the area of exoplanets. So as my title suggests, what I want to do today is to provide you with a brief history of exoplanets from their discovery to present. I'm going to hide this, it keeps coming back again. Yeah, so so first of all, let me clarify, let me explain to you what exoplanets are. So exoplanets are planets that orbit stars other than the sun. So today I will talk about a brief history of exoplanets in the last 25 years. As I was telling you, for centuries, the only planetary system that we knew of was our own solar system. And but since 1995, we now know of planets or planetary systems around other stars other than the sun. Such planets are called exoplanets or extrasolar planets or exoplanetary systems for such planetary systems. So it has been 25 years, and since 1995, when the first discovery of a planet around a sun-like star was made, since then there have been several more discoveries, and as of now, we know more than 4,200, over 4,000 such planets around stars other than the sun. And what I want to do today, what I want to tell you is the story of how we discovered these planets, starting from 1990 with the first planet in 1995 to more than 4,000 of them. And I would try to summarize or try to capture this in this plot here, which I'm showing. On the x-axis or the horizontal axis, what I show here is the distance from the central star of the planet. Okay, this is shown in the units of AU or astronomical units. 1 astronomical unit is the distance from the sun to Earth. So at 1 you can see Earth. I show all the solar system planets here, and on the vertical axis I show the planet mass of the planet in the unit of Earth mass. So 1 corresponds to Earth. So Earth is at 1 astronomical unit and it has 1 Earth mass. So that's here. And here you see all the 4 rocky or terrestrial planets in our solar system. And here are the giant planets in our solar system. Jupiter is at 5 astronomical units. Jupiter is 5 times as far from the sun as Earth is. And Saturn and Uranus and Neptune, they are all much more massive than Earth and other rocky planets. So this was the situation in 1995 when the first exosolar planet was discovered. The first planet discovered was more like a Jupiter kind of planet, around half a Jupiter mass planet, but very close to the central star, a central star called 51 Pegasi. So this was the situation in 1995, and I want to show you the situation now. I will go back and forth between this. See, this was 1995, and this is 2020. You see, we have discovered several more, over 4,000 planets, and this plane is kind of getting saturated. You can see different parts of this plane is being populated now. So notice a bunch of stars here, planets here, which are so this is, you know, the horizontal axis, as I told you, is the distance from Sun to the planet, and they are all, most of them are much closer than the orbit of Mercury. Mercury is the innermost planet to us, right? There are a lot of planets which are well within Mercury's orbit, and there are a lot of giant planets which are here, and there are also planets which are several tens to hundreds of astronomical units away from the central star as well. So what I'm going to tell you is this story, how we came about, how we discovered the systems, and from 25 years since 1995, how we have, how astronomers and astrophysicists have discovered this over 4,000 planets. So that's going to be the story. And so the three topics that I'll cover. First, I'll talk a little bit about the discovery itself. And I will also try to tell you, this part will be a little technical, because I also want to tell you why it took till 1995 for these exoplanetary systems to be discovered. And I'll also briefly discuss about the impact this discovery had. And then I will talk a little bit about detection techniques. How do we detect exosolar planets? See, these systems are far away from us. They are not like solar system planets where we can send missions or spacecraft. So these are far away around other stars. So how do we detect them? So over in the last 25 years, we have invented or innovated several different techniques, and I will talk about that, and I'll briefly summarize the current census of planets, how the more than 4,000 planets and what are they, and what kind of planets they are, etc. And finally, I will try to briefly summarize what we have learned from these exoplanets. Are they similar to a solar system? How are the properties? So somebody is annotating the slide. Could you please ask them to stop doing? Yeah, thanks. So that's what I plan to do in this talk. So first, about the discovery. So the first planet that was discovered around a sun-like star that happened in 1995. And for this discovery, Michael Mayer and Didier Queloz, the two Swiss astronomers, were awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics last year in 2019. So this was for the discovery. This was the Nobel citation. It was for the discovery of an exoplanet orbiting a solar type star. The key word here is solar type star. So here I should qualify this. See, the first planet around a star other than the sun discovered was not in 1995. It was in 1992, and it was discovered around a dead star, a pulsar, which is basically a dead star. But it soon turned out that planets around such dead stars like pulsars or neutron stars are very rare. But this was the first planet in 1995, which was discovered around a sun-like star, like a normal star. Okay. So how did they discover this? So they used a technique called radial velocity technique. So let me try to explain this to you, how they did it. So when a planet goes around the star, it's not just that the planet is going around the star. In fact, from Newtonian mechanics, you know that both the star and planet are going around the center of mass of the system. So the star is also moving, right? So both so it's almost like, they are joined by a stick or a rod, and then they are both are moving about the center of mass around with respect to that rod. So the point is, the star is also moving, and we can make use of this fact. The star is much brighter and easier to detect. So if you do spectroscopy of the star, so astronomers can obtain the spectra of the star. See, you see the star is now it's going away from us, and now it's coming towards us. So what happens is that the spectral lines, characteristic of various elements, these lines will start when it's going. So now it's going away from us. It will be red shifted. And when the star is coming towards us, the spectral lines will be blue shifted. So you all have learned about the Doppler shift, right? If the source emitting the light is moving with respect to us, then the lines will also move back and forth from that line. So this Doppler shift is defined as the wavelength observed, the wavelength that we actually observe, minus the actual wavelength of the line divided by the actual wavelength of the line. And if you so the wavelength observed is what we observe. So this is what I've tried to show here. See, the star is moving. So the observer is at the bottom of the page here. Okay. So now the star is moving away from the observer. So you see how the velocity, you can measure this radial velocity. You see how the lines are moving. When the star is now it's moving away from us, so the lines are redshifted. All these lines you see, when the star is coming towards us, it will move in the other direction. So you keep measuring this, the wavelength of the line, one particular line, whose original wavelength we know. Then we can compute this radial velocity, and then you can put together this curve, which is called the radial velocity curve. So basically, the star is you will get such periodograms. Once you typically what astronomers do is we measure this radial velocity shifts of thousands of lines in the spectrum. See, stars have various elements, right? Like hydrogen, helium, and other heavy elements. So we measure all those lines and measure this radial shift. And this is exactly what Michel Mayor and Didier Queloz did in 1995 when they first discovered a Jupiter mass planet around a sun-like star. So the planet that they discovered had a mass half of that of Jupiter, but it was very close to the star called 51 Pegasi, about 0.05 AU. So Earth, remember, Earth is at 1 AU and Mercury is at 0.3 AU or something. So this is much closer to the central star. So they constructed this, what is called the radial velocity periodogram. Once you have one, so from this you can measure the period of the planet, or you're measuring the star, but it's a star and planet will have the same period because they are moving about the center of mass. And you can also measure what is called the radial velocity semi-amplitude, this velocity, the maximum radial velocity. Once you can measure these two, you can measure the mass of the planet from this equation. This is from simple Newtonian equation. So this is what they did, Michel Mayor and Queloz in their paper, and then when they first discovered the planet, and they found the mass to be around half the Jupiter mass and period to be about close to 4 days. So just to impress upon you that it's not it's a technically challenging discovery. That is why it took until 1995 to discover the first exosolar planet, because the signal that Jupiter around a Jupiter-like planet around Sun will produce, the radial velocity semi-amplitude is 12 meters per second. And let me show you how difficult it is to detect this motion. So to detect this 12 meters per second radial velocity shift, you need to have a radial velocity precision in your spectrograph of 2 to 3 meters per second. Now, your typical spectrograph typical spectrograph has a resolving power of something like 50,000. So lambda by delta lambda. So some of the MSc students would recognize this. This is how you define the resolving power of a spectrograph. That corresponds to a spectral resolution element, or delta lambda of 0.1 angstrom. And typically you have to sample this spectral resolution element over 2 pixels at least. So which will correspond to dispersion of 0.05 angstrom per pixel. And this corresponds to 2 to 3 kilometers per second per pixel. So this is the typical pixel size of a spectrograph that astronomers use. But you have to measure, you have to have a precision of 2 to 3 meters per second. So one has to measure the wavelength shift to a precision of 1,000th of a pixel size. So this is the challenge. See, to detect an Earth-like planet, it has to be 1 by 10, have 100,000th of a pixel. See, a typical pixel size of a charge-coupled device that we use in an astronomical spectrograph or CCDs is 15 micrometers. And so to measure 1,000th or 100,000th of 15 micrometer means we are measuring fraction of a nanometer. This velocity shift that we have to measure of the lines moving back and forth, that's a fraction of a nanometer. So that is what is challenging. So the biggest problem is that astronomical spectrographs, when you attach it to a telescope, they are not very stable. A slight movement will, make all the accuracy go haywire. So the stability was the issue. So there are two ways in which people who are looking for these signatures try to stabilize the spectrograph. So there are two techniques. One is precise instrumental calibration. Even if there is no stability, if you can calibrate the movement of your spectrograph very well, you could perhaps reproduce the lines. The other one was to remove the spectrograph from the back of the telescope and keep in evacuated room, where the temperature, everything is stabilized, and use optical fibers to connect it to the spectrograph. So these were the two techniques. So one was the absorption spell spectroscopy, so to calibrate the spectrograph itself. So what you do is, at the entrance of the spectrograph, you keep a cell of gas of iodine or hydrogen fluoride, which will produce their own spectra. So the starlight will pass through this cell of gas, and they will also produce the lines. So you can calibrate these lines, iodine lines. So it will go through all the way, the entire path that the starlight also traverses. So if the spectrograph is not stable or moves, these lines will also suffer exactly the same shifts. So you can calibrate it out. So this was a very powerful technique. In fact, this was the first technique that was implemented in the 80s and 90s. And you could reach to the required or the desired precision of a few meters per second. The other thing I was telling you was decouple the spectrograph from the telescope, keep it in a thermally stabilized, room, evacuated room, clean room, and so that stabilize the spectrographs. And a few teams did that in the late 90s. And from this, you could, so here is what I show here is the radial velocity precisions achieved as a function of year, how over time it has improved. So this spectrograph was used for the first discovery by Michel Mayer and Didier Queloz, so about a few meters per second. But you see this line in the 80s by Bruce Campbell and Gordon Walker. So they had roughly the same precision as the discoverers in 1995. They had that precision already in 1980. See, this is such a tragic story. See, they had the precision. They pioneered this technique. But it so happened that they observed the wrong stars. So they observed 20 stars, and they all turned out to be the ones which didn't have planets. So they were just unlucky. We now know that if they had looked at any of the 200 stars within 25 parsecs, they would have detected it. They would have detected the first exosolar planet in 1980. So this was the story was tragic also because Bruce Campbell, who was a young student and later he was a postdoctoral fellow who developed this technique, who actually pioneered this absorption cell technique. So he had to leave astronomy. He went jobless. Nobody gave him a job because nobody understood the importance of this technique. It would only, later, a decade later, that people would actually demonstrate that this technique worked, and you could, in fact, detect an exoplanet with this technique. So what this discovery did was to provide an impetus to the entire field. See, until then, the people who were working on exoplanets were considered to be, people who were doing some crazy things. Nobody really took this field seriously. But this really brought the exoplanet research from the margins of astrophysics to the center. And also, this discovery prompted a lot of people to work on it and developing and innovating new detection techniques. And I will talk about a few of them. And it also prompted planning of several highly productive space missions by NASA, ESA, and now recently by our own space agency, ISRO. And as I said, it propelled exoplanetology from the margins to the mainstream. So here are some of the quotes from people who have been working in this field from mid 90s or early 90s, and who were saying that this field was so obscure and fringe and laughable. This is Sarah Seeger, and now it has become Nobel worthy. So this was really a revolutionary transformation that this happened to this field in the last 25 years. And the Nobel in 2019 was a celebration of that, the importance of this field and what it has achieved. So this discovery, the first discovery, also provided motivation for a lot of discoveries, a lot of development of new techniques. So radial velocity technique was what Mayer and Culos used. And then there is something called transit techniques, which in 2000 was jointly developed or demonstrated by Henry and Charbonneau. But this has now become the most powerful technique in detecting exoplanets. And there were a lot of other techniques. But radial velocity and transit technique account for more than 98% of about 98% of the exoplanet discovered, over 4,000 exoplanets discovered now. So these are the most dominant techniques. So I'll mostly be talking about these two. And the exoplanet missions that this discovery sort of provided the pathway or the impetus were the following. So I in particular wanted to highlight two: the Kepler mission by NASA and this ExoWorld mission by ISRO. So this probably will go up in 2028 or something. But so this is going to be a very interesting mission. And so in India also we are beginning to have an exoplanet community. So hopefully in the next decade it will grow significantly. So let's look at some of the detection techniques. So so we have already seen radial velocity. Now let's look at the transit method. So say a planet is going around the stars, and suppose if the orbital plane is aligned such that it's our line of sight exactly coincides with it. When the planet enters the star, there will be a dip in the star's brightness. Very little, very small dip, but nevertheless a dip, right? So if you can measure this, then you can say a lot about the planet. So often this is, see, for example, a Jupiter around Sun would produce a dip of 1% level. But Earth, like a small planet, it's really very small. But we have such a sort of precision now. So this is to show you how to measure radius of the planet from transit observations. So notice here that when planets of two different sizes transit the central star, the one with larger radius will have a deeper the transit depth. See? So let me play that again. So this is the planet with the larger planet. This is a smaller planet. You notice that when the larger planet goes around the stellar disk, it will produce a larger depth. Whereas the smaller one is a smaller depth. And let us see the situation. Let us see how the situation would look like if you have multiple planets of different sizes. So this can have all kinds of complications. I mean, how it's not trivial to analyze. See, what you observe is finally only this light curve, right? So look at the largest planet is transiting this radius, so the stellar disk. So it is producing a thing, the dip. And then the next planet is coming along. It will produce a dip, even while it's still transiting the other planet enters. So you can imagine all kinds of complex light curves, but it's possible now. We have the ability to model this and extract information about the planets, and particularly the radius of the planet. So the transit depth immediately tells you the planet radius if you know the stellar radius. So because the transit depth is just the ratio of the areas, area of the planet to area of the star. So if you know the stellar radius, you can immediately get the planet radius. So remember, the radial velocity technique allowed us to measure the mass of the planet, uncertain to the extent of the angle with which the orbital plane is tilted with respect to us. And the transit depth will give you the radius of the planet. But transit observations will also allow you to measure the angle, this tilt of the angle. So if you observe a planet with both radial velocity technique and transit method, you can measure the true mass of the planet and the radius of the planet. once you have the true mass and the radius of the planet, you can have an estimate of the bulk density of the planet, assuming planet to be spherical in shape. You can just do mass divided by 4/3 pi r cubed. So that will give you the bulk density of the planet. So bulk density can already tell you a lot about the planets. So we will come to that. But before that, let us just take a look at the current census. So as I show here, maybe this is better. See, the radial velocity and transit technique account for 96% of the known planets now. So there are around more than 4,000 planets known, as I was telling you. So most of them are discovered by radial velocity and transit method. Also notice that it's a transit method which accounts for more than 77%. So here is the current status as of 8th October 2020. I'll explain the graph in a minute, but right now the number is 4,292 confirmed planets. 724 of these are in multi-planetary systems. So it's not just there is one planet around a star, but there are 724 multi-planetary systems, and over 5,000 planets are yet to be confirmed. So this number is going to go up dramatically in the coming years. Now coming to the plot, so what I show here is the discovery year, and on the y-axis is the cumulative number of detections. So what I want you to notice is the red is for radial velocities. The discovery was in 95, the first one. Then the first decade, it was mostly radial velocity technique. Then you can see around 2013 or so, the transit method starts picking up. And now you can see how the green bar, which corresponds to the transit method, that dominates. And this is all because of NASA's Kepler satellite, which was launched in 2009, but the data started coming in from 2013. And once it started coming in, it's just started dominating. So out of the 4,000 or more planets that we know, more than 3,000 or close to 3,000 is from, or even close to 3,500 is from Kepler, or close to 3,000 roughly. And that is what I show you. This was the Kepler mission, launched in 2009, and the mission lasted till 2013. What Kepler did was, it just stared at a piece of sky, a 10 degree by 10 degree sky for 4 years. Just looked at that patch of the sky and keep measuring the stellar brightness for 4 years continuously. So all the planets, when they orbit, the stellar light will go down, right? That will dip. So it measured it for 4 years continuously. And that is why it was able to discover the confirmed planets, close to 2,400, but another 2,400 to be confirmed, yet to be confirmed candidates. So it was Kepler that truly revolutionized our understanding of exoplanets. So just to tell you the sheer diversity in the planetary system that we have discovered. So until 2.5 years ago or so, solar system was the only planetary system with 8 planets. We have 8 planets in the solar system, right? The 4 terrestrial or rocky planets close to the sun: Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, and then the 4 giants, the 2 ice giants, which are Jupiter, the two gas giants, are Jupiter and Saturn, and then the farther out 2 ice giants, Uranus and Neptune. But solar system does not have that distinction anymore. About 2.5 years ago, Kepler 90 system was discovered, which had 8 such planets. Not very similar to us, but 8 planets in total. And then to give you an idea of the sheer diversity, in 2.5 years ago or so, this system was discovered, the TRAPPIST-1 system, around a very cool star. This star has a mass of about 1/100th of stellar mass, or something like that, something close to that. Very cool star. Around that, this planetary system with 7 rocky planets were discovered. But what was really interesting about this planetary system was, see, the entire system would fit within the orbit of Mercury. So this is an extremely compact planetary system. See, Mercury is the closest planet in our solar system. That is the closest planet to the sun. But this entire thing would fit in within the orbit of Mercury. So that is on one side, and on the other side there is this planetary system with 4 gas giants, 4 Jupiter-like planets around a star called HR 8799. See, what I'm showing here is images of the system. These are directly imaged. So you block the central star was blocked using a coronagraph, and then you start seeing the 4 planets, you see. And these are images taken over 9 years. And we are just showing the image one after the other. So you actually see planets moving, right? So this is the harmonic motion of the nature in action. You can actually see that here. But these are quite extended systems. So these are at 15 times to 75 times the distance from Earth to Sun distance. See, our solar system, the farthest planet is Neptune, which is about 30 astronomical units, right? So 30 times the Sun-Earth distance. Beyond that, we only have this some rocky objects, right? But this the 4th planet here, the most distant one here, it's about 75 astronomical units. 15. So what we have discovered is all kinds of planetary systems with very different architecture compared to our solar system. So all this have come as a big surprise to us. So in the last 25 years, one of the things that we have learned, as I will summarize in a moment, that solar system, the exoplanetary systems do not look like our solar system at all. And that is what I will spend the remaining time. So now we have over 4,000 planets, and we can now start asking the questions like, so how do exoplanetary systems look like? So are they similar to are there architectures similar to our solar systems? So what are the properties of these exoplanets? Are they like the planets that we have in our solar system? Are they different? So what is the most common planet in the universe or in our galaxy? So now we are in a position to ask these questions. And we have been carrying out this work at TIFR, some of us, and I'll try to summarize some of the results and from these studies and what we have learned about these exoplanetary systems. So let me give you the results, what we have learned right away upfront, and then I will show you why we think, how we have learned about them. So what the take-home points? So from this talk, what I really want to remember are these 3 points. So from all this, the last 25 years of research by astrophysicists, what we have learned about planetary systems around stars other than the sun are these 3 mainly. See, there are many other things too, but I'm summarizing this. So these are the most fundamental or the most important, in my opinion. First, planetary systems are ubiquitous in the universe. So it looks as if every star in our galaxy hosts a planet. And it also turns out that a star typically hosts more than 1 planet. So what it means is that there are more planets in our galaxy than stars. So this has been one of the contribution of Kepler satellite. So Kepler has shown us that it is very likely that there are more planets in our galaxy than stars. So this is the first take-home point. The second thing that we have learned is about our solar system. Our solar system is not a very representative planetary system. Most of the planetary systems that we have discovered do not look anything like our solar system. They look very different, both in architecture, in the orbital period, orbital distance, and also in terms of planet properties. So that's the second point. Third, the planet properties seem to be very closely connected to the host star properties, the stars which they are around. So it's almost as if the planets know what star they are born around. So in the remaining of the talk, so can I take another 10-20 minutes or so?
Yes, please. Yes.
Yeah. So in the remaining of this talk, I'll just try to explain to you how we came to these conclusions. Okay. So first, planetary systems are ubiquitous in the universe. So see, for this, we need to measure, what we astrophysicists do is we measure a quantity called the occurrence rate. So occurrence rate is just the mean number of planets per star having properties of radius or orbital field in a specified range. But in a simple words, occurrence rate is just the number of planets detected divided by the total number of stars surveyed. Okay. See, it was, suppose if we had surveyed every star in our galaxy, every 100 billion star, there are more than 100 billion stars in our galaxy. If we had looked at them for every one of them, then it is just this ratio, number of planets detected by the number of. But even with Kepler, we have just stared at one patch of the sky for 4 years. That's it, right? But then, so there are a lot of selection biases and observational selection effects and biases in our sample. But we can correct for this because the way Kepler does these observations and how the data is handled, it's all very very homogeneously and very uniformly. We know that very well. So we can correct for this. So let me just tell you one such selection bias that can happen. Okay, so Kepler was a Kepler satellite discovered planets using this method called transit method, right? So in transit method, so let's say, so you are the observer, the star is here, the planet is moving. When the planet is coming in between you and the star, you will see a dip in the brightness. But this is true only if the orbit is this way. But what if it is face on and the planet is going around? You will never see a transit. But that doesn't mean that there is no planet around the star. So you have to correct for this. So you have to, but luckily we can see one can mathematically formulate the geometric probability of a transit for a randomly oriented orbital planes. So one does that, and then one can also account for the detection deficiency and the noise level of the star. All these biases and selections can be taken care of, and we have done that. And this is the result that a student of mine and I obtained. So what this is showing you is occurrence rate. So number of planets per 100 stars of different radius. So if the radius is 1 to 2 Earth radius, 1 or 2 times Earth radius, we call them Earth-like planets. If it is between 2 to 4 Earth radius, we call them super Earths. And if it is 4 to 8 Earth radius, we will call them ice giants. See, Neptune and Uranus has roughly about the size of 4 Earth radius. Whereas Jupiter and Saturn are about 8 to 10 Earth radius. They are called gas giants. So these are Earth-like planets, these are super Earths, these are Neptune, Uranus kind of planets, which we will call them ice giants, and these are Jupiter or Saturn kind of planets. But it looks like Earth-like and super Earths are the most, in fact, the super Earth kind of planets are the most abundant planets. Or in other words, smaller planets are much more abundant than the giant planets. So this was one of the major discovery. So just to tell you what I'm talking about. So these planets, these are our terrestrial planets, the inner planets from us. So this is what we'll call Earth-like planets. And these are the ice giants, Neptune and Uranus. So Uranus and Neptune. So these have radius of 4 Earth radius, or 4 times the Earth radius. And these are Jupiter and Saturn, about 10 Earth radius. So what we find is Earths and super Earths are much more ubiquitous. For every 100 stars, there are about 58 to 60 Earths and super Earths. Whereas giant planets, so planets like Jupiter and Saturn are only about 7 per 100 stars. So there are many more smaller planets than gas giants when we look at the planets around other systems. And if you were to look at the total occurrence rate, irrespective of radius or mass or orbital period or anything, the total, you collapse everything. And if you calculate the total occurrence rate, what we get is for every about 1.3 to 1.5 planets per star. This is on average. Doesn't mean that there is a 0.3 planets, but on average, there are more than 1 planet per star in our galaxy. So this is why I was saying earlier, there are more planets than stars in our galaxy. Okay. So I hope that much is clear. So there are planetary systems are ubiquitous. Now our studies in the last 25 years have shown us that planets are quite common. Planetary systems are quite common, and there are more smaller planets than giant planets, and there are many more planets. On average, around a star, there are 1.5 planets per star. So the second point that we have learned is that our solar system is not very representative. That the planetary systems around other stars that we have discovered look very different from our planetary system, from our solar system. So what I show here is the distribution of number of planets with a given radius, and the radius is given in the units of Earth radius. Okay, so I have shown the radius of Earth here. That's 1 is Earth radius, and Neptune is 4 times Earth radius, and Jupiter is about 10 times Earth radius. These vertical dashed lines correspond to Earth radius, Neptune radius, and Jupiter radius. And you see, this is the distribution. You see where the distribution is peaking, distribution of the radius. It's peaking between the radius of Earth and Neptune, about 2 to 3 Earth radius or something. We do not have a planet like this in our solar system, right? So after Earth, it's Neptune. So we do not have a planet with radius radius or mass between that of Earth or Neptune. But most of the exosolar planetary systems or exoplanetary systems seem to have such a planet. This is the most common planet in our galaxy. But solar system do not have the most common planet. So that's one. The other thing is, so if you now plot the distribution of orbital period. So this is the orbital period of Mercury. Mercury takes 88 days to go around the sun, and Earth takes 365 days, of course. But look at the orbital period of the planets that we have discovered around other stars. They peak around 10 days. So most of the exoplanetary systems are very close to their host star, unlike our solar system. Our solar system look like an outlier. It looks like an outlier. And this has come as a surprise to us as well. So if I were to now make a plot of a planet radius on the vertical axis and the orbital period, you can clearly see this. So the red dots here are the solar system planets. You see, most of the planets that we have discovered are well within the orbit of Mercury, and most of them have radius between that of Earth and Neptune. So this is where it's peaking. So solar system is not an archetypal planetary system. And now we move to the last point that I want to make, that we have learned in the last 25 years. Planet properties are very closely connected to the host star properties. So it's almost as if I know what my star is, I can predict what planets are going to be around that star. And why do I say this? Because of this. Let's see this. So so when I say planet properties are closely connected to the stellar properties, host star or the central star properties, I'm talking about the observed properties of both planets and stars. Now, for planets, exosolar planets, the properties that we can measure are the radius of the planet and the mass of the planet. As we have seen, if you are detected with radial velocity technique and transit method, you can measure both its mass and radius, and both the technique will give you the orbital period. So these are the three measurable quantities of exoplanets: its radius, its mass, and its orbital period. And for host stars, when I say the observed properties, these are the temperature of the star, the surface temperature of the star. You know about the surface temperature of the stars, right? In the night, if you look up at the sky, some of the stars look red, some of the stars look blue, and that's because they have different temperatures. The hotter stars will appear bluer, and the redder stars will appear, the cooler stars will appear redder. So it turns out that the surface temperature of the star is connected, or the planet properties are connected to the temperature of the star. See, the temperature of the star is also a proxy for the mass of the star. The hotter stars are more massive than the cooler stars. Okay, so keep that in mind. So here, just to give you an idea about the temperatures, the more massive stars are bluish, and the very low mass stars are reddish, and everything else in between. Sun is a G-type star. It's about yellowish. And these are the surface temperatures listed in Kelvin. So Sun is around 5,700. That's a yellow star. But in the Kepler field, I mean, we have only studied about F, J, K, and M-type stars. Very massive stars we have not studied. So we will only talk about these. So G is the Sun-like stars, and then stars which are even less massive than Sun, much less massive than Sun. So what do we find? So we are using the spectral type here. So M-type is the coolest, the least massive, then K-type, then G, the Sun-like star. Then F-type is more massive than Sun. What we find is that this is the occurrence rate again. Around the least massive star, there are more planets, or cooler stars host more planets than the hotter stars. So an M-type star, or the coolest star, have many more planets. I mean, roughly host around 2 planets per star than a Sun-like star, or even more massive star. So this also came as a surprise to us. Though the coolest star, or the least massive star, seems to host more planets. But even more interesting is that the coolest star, although the coolest star here, the M-type stars are shown in red, although they mostly have the 1 to 2 Earth radius planet and 2 to 4 Earth radius, Earths and the super Earths or mini Neptunes, the smaller planets they host, the red bars. But the cool stars do not host giant planets. So the low mass stars do not appear to host massive planets like Jupiter's. Although they host more planets, most of the planets the cool stars or the low mass star hosts are smaller Earth-like planets, rocky planets. So this was something else that we have learned. So that's about the relation between planet mass and stellar mass, with the temperature as a proxy. Now, there is very interestingly or intriguingly, we found a relation between the planet properties, or radius of the planet, or mass of the planets, and the host star metallicity. I don't know if you are familiar with this. See, let me just try to explain to you in simple terms. See, the most abundant element in the universe is hydrogen. And hydrogen is also the first element, right? We are atomic number 1. 72 or 70% of the universe by mass is hydrogen. Then it's helium. The second most abundant element in the universe is helium. That's about 28%. All the rest of the elements are only 2% by mass. Astronomers call all the elements higher than helium as metals. So when for stars, astronomers say the metallicity of stars. So when we say metallicity of star, what we mean is the content, the heavy element content of the star. All the metal content, all the heavy elements. And we usually denote it using the iron abundance. Fe is iron. So it turns out that planet properties are related to how much heavy elements are there in the central star. This came as quite a surprise to us. And even in the early 2000s, people started noticing this trend. And so here is one histogram. So this is a kind of an average result. What I want to really tell you is that the metallicity of stars without planets is less than metallicity of stars with small planets, is less than the metallicity of stars hosting giant planets. Or in other words, what we are seeing is that stars that have Jupiter-like planets seem to have very high metallicity, very high heavy element content. So the average metallicity sort of increases when you go from smaller radius to larger radius of the planet. The average metallicity of the central star. So this is another way of saying this. Here, this distribution, what I show is this metallicity. So let's say the green bar is the solar metallicity, or sun's metallicity. Red is subsolar metallicity, and blue is supersolar metallicity higher than the sun. So you see the larger radius planets
Dr. Manoj, you are not audible now. Sorry, there's an interruption. Dr. Manoj will be back soon. Please wait.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please share your screen.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we
Sorry,
can hear you.
I think it's
Yeah.
probably problem on my side. I don't know, not sure. So I probably.
But your screen is not visible now. Please share the screen.
Okay, let me do that. Can you see now? Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, it's
Yes,
fine
doctor,
now.
we can.
Yes,
We can.
yes.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Okay, so I was saying the planet mass and radius, the size of the planet seems to be related to the heavy element content of the host star. So the larger planets are preferentially found around stars with higher metallicity, but that trend, so the metallicity of the heavy element content of the host star increases when the planet mass increases, but there is a turnover at around 4 Jupiter mass or something, 4 times Jupiter mass or something, then it kind of drops. So we were the first to point this out, or second to point this out. This actually may point to a different formation mechanism. We will discuss that. I can discuss this during the question answer session. So this is another thing. So let me summarize now. So I tried to describe I talked about the discovery of exoplanets and the various detection techniques, and also about the current census and then I also try to summarize what we have learned in the last 25 years of research on exoplanets. So as I was telling you, since its discovery in 1995, we now know of more than 4,000 exoplanetary systems. And from analyzing these systems, I have tried to summarize what we have learned into 3 main points. The first one is that planetary systems are quite common. The total occurrence rate. So on average, there are about, there are more than 1 planet per star, implying that there are more planets in our galaxy than stars. Smaller planets like our Earth and Venus and Mars, smaller planets, rocky planets with radius less than 4 Earth radius are much more plentiful or abundant than the gas giants like Jupiter, like planets. And we also find that there are more smaller planets around low mass stars or cooler stars than sun-like stars. Okay. The second point, second important thing that we learned is that solar system is not an archetypal planetary system. It's not very representative of planetary systems, it looks like. The exoplanetary systems that we have discovered, the most common planet in the galaxy is not in the solar system. Our solar system do not have a super Earth or a mini Neptune. And neither do we have so most of the exoplanetary systems look like very compact systems. They are very close to the central star. And the third thing that we have learned is that the observed properties of planets like radius, mass, and orbital period strongly depend on the host star properties, such as the surface temperature of the star or the heavy element content of the star. what we're finding is that so the more massive planets are preferentially found around metal-rich or stars with higher heavy element content. And we also find that cooler stars have fewer giant planets. The low mass stars do not have many giant planets or Jupiter-like planets, but they host many more smaller planets than Sun-like stars. See these results. So this third set of results are probably much more profound than the first two, because they have very important implications for the planet formation theories. See, I don't want to go into that, but during the question answer session, I can address why they are important for planet formation theories. So I will stop here and take questions.
Okay, Dr. Manoj Puravankara, it was a fantastic talk, very interesting. Let me take up some questions.
Yeah, please.
The first one is from Mr. Anand Manu Shankar. So he wants to know which is the closest exoplanet discovered. What is the closest?
Closest to our sun, I mean.
Yeah.
Yeah,
or maybe towards us.
I mean, towards us meaning closest to the yeah. So the closest star to us, the Proxima Centauri, probably hosts a planet. So the Proxima Centauri is less than a parsec. So it's about a few light years. So it's about 2 light years or something. Yeah. So the closest star to us appear to have an exoplanet.
Okay. And another from Mr. Niranjan J. Pillai. Can a solar sail be used to reach exoplanets?
Say that again. Sorry, I missed the first part.
Can solar sail be used
to solar
reach
what?
Exoplanets? Sail, S-A-I-L.
So solar sail. Yeah. So, but then you can work it out yourself. You just work out how. So you know the principle. I mean, I hope the person who was asked this question probably knows how it works. So it works on the principle of radiation pressure, right? Of the radiation from the sun should carry it forward. So you can work it out and see how big. Radiation pressure on a sail depends on its area also. How big a sail you would require. So there are technical challenges to that. Yeah, you can look it up. It's yeah.
Okay. And Mr. Ashwin Kumar Tiwari, does our sun and all planets also revolve around the center of mass? Does our sun and all planets?
So we are on Earth, and Earth goes around the sun, and so the sun. So we have solar system around sun. But sun is only one of a average star in our galaxy, and our galaxy is a spiral galaxy. It has a stellar disk, and the galaxy is going. The entire galaxy, the disk of the galaxy, all the stars are going around the galactic center. In the center of the galaxy, we have a supermassive black hole. So there's a lot of mass at the center of the galaxy. So sun is about 8 kiloparsec. So that's about so let's say 8,000 parsecs. So about 24,000 light years or so from the center of our galaxy. So sun and everything is going around the galactic center. I don't know if that is what you had in mind when you asked this question, but yeah, on a galactic scale, yes, sun and everything is going around the galactic center.
Mass, okay. Mr. Shaji, Shaji Albert, can you please take up some questions from the YouTube?
Yeah, we have a few questions thank you, Doctor. We have a few questions in YouTube. One is about the TRAPPIST system. We hear about possible habitable exoplanets like Kepler-22b or some planets of TRAPPIST system.
Yeah.
Is there any proposed technology which might help us send probes to those faraway bodies?
No.
YouTube.
No, the closest is Proxima Centauri. That's about 3 light years, right? It would take 3 years for light to reach there. So you can imagine. So we cannot really send anything there. I mean, we'll have to rely on the light or some other, information to bring us. So that will take a longer time. But about the habitability things, so people talk about habitability using a very somewhat restrictive definition. So one must be careful about what they mean. So right now, when we talk about habitability, we only mean that the temperature and pressure should be such that on the surface of that whatever planet that we are calling habitable, that water should exist in liquid form. So this is because our life on Earth is based on liquid water. So that's the sort of working definition of habitability. So when you say a planet is in habitable zone, what that means is that the equilibrium temperature, the light from the radiation from the central star will be absorbed by the planet and it will emit, and so it will arrive at a equilibrium temperature. So that temperature should be at that temperature water should exist in liquid form. But it's a little more complicated than that, because planets also have atmospheres, and then there can be greenhouse effects and all that. So the right now when we say habitable, we only mean probably the equilibrium temperature, but that's not the whole story.
Yeah, Dr. Srikumar, can I ask another question?
Yes, please.
Yeah, it's about the hypothetical planet 9. Does it exist, and is there a possibility of the planet 9 being a black hole?
I don't know about the second part of the question, but yeah. So there are some. See, the what is being proposed is that if you look at the dynamical properties of the other planets in our solar system, there seems to be some dynamical signature of the presence of another planet beyond Neptune. But I don't know very much about it. I mean, about the black hole part, probably. I don't know what the question meant, but yeah. So yeah, that's all I can say about it.
Yeah, there is another question by Mr. Hari Krishnan. Does the distance of a planet from its star affect the transit dip?
Say that again.
Does the distance of a planet from its star affect the transit dip?
Oh, transit depth. No. Transit depth is just the area of the. So it's the ratio of the area of the planet, the pi r planet square divided by pi r star square. The distance. See, that is because we are far away, right? And the distance from the planet to the star to the planet is very small. So it's just the function of area. But the transit probability will depend on that. Whether we'll detect a transit or not, that is a function of that orbital distance. And the transit duration. How long will the transit last?
Dr. Srikumar, you can continue. There is not many questions here.
Okay, there is another question from Ms. Aarti Dopalkar. Are there any exoplanets detected so far by amateur astronomers in a citizen science project such as Panoptes?
I don't know what is specific, but yeah. So there are a few, but even more interesting was when Google tried to use machine learning algorithms to detect planets. So that there is also that. So yeah, so people are trying this, and there are a few now being discovered. See, especially from this archival data from Kepler and some of the. So there is a latest mission, a NASA mission called TESS, that also is turning up planets. Yeah.
Okay. And she again asks, out of the 4,292 exoplanets detected so far, which according to you think life may exist and why?
No, so this is so I already talked about habitability. See, we are not in a position to say anything about that now. Right now, we are kind of classifying them into planets, Earth-like planets, and falling within the habitable zone of their star. So the definition, that working definition used is water should be able to exist in liquid form. So it depends on how the equilibrium temperature of the planet. That in turn depends on how close it is to the central star. But it also depends on the details of the atmosphere of the planet, right? Because Venus in solar system is within the habitable zone by that definition, but nothing can survive there. Venus's temperatures are, very high, right? It's about 700 Kelvin or something. That's because of the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect. It's carbon dioxide atmosphere. There's 97% carbon dioxide. So there are, so so in some of the cases we have measured atmospheric properties of stars, but it's still a work in progress. So that's the next frontier.
Okay.
The atmosphere, measuring the atmospheric properties of exoplanets is the next research frontier in exoplanet science.
Okay, sir. And there is another question from Mr. Honhar Gupta. If a solar star has many planets, it should rotate around center of mass of every planet and star. So how can we say it has only one exoplanet or many?
So it's possible that we don't know, but there are ways of doing that also. See, if there are other planets, it's dynamical signature. So the gravitational influence that these planets have on the one that we detect will show up. So I didn't tell you about all the different detection techniques. I primarily focused on radial velocity and transit technique, but there are many more. One such thing is transit timing variation. See, when you observe a planet in a transit, and then if you keep observing it, and if its transit timing period is not exactly the same every time, it immediately tells you that there are other planets in the system. So there are ways of detecting unseen planets purely from the dynamic effect. So it's possible, yeah.
Okay. One question from Mr. Dheer Goradia. Can we use solar storms to detect exoplanets?
Solar storms from the sun, right? So I don't understand that question. Solar storm will only affect our solar system planets. How do you detect exoplanets with that?
Okay. We'll go to another question from Birilla. Has any exoplanets shown of life so far?
No. So we this is what I've been telling you. So we are still trying to identify planets which are in the habitable zone. Life, another question comes next, but that is as I was telling you, the next research frontier is measuring the atmosphere of exoplanets. So people are already talking about biosignatures or biomarkers in the atmosphere. So just to clarify this, so let's say if somebody, some person in some other planet, if they want to know if Earth has life in it, what would they look for in the atmosphere of Earth? I mean, if they get a spectra of the Earth's atmosphere, oxygen, O2, right? I mean, so O2 is a biomarker. So if you can detect molecular oxygen in the atmosphere of a planet, then that tells you that it's possible that life can exist. That's all it can tell you. See, there is a big space telescope going up next year called JWST, the James Webb Space Telescope, to be jointly launched by NASA and European Space Agency. JWST is going to stare at one of the exoplanets for almost about 100 hours. That's a lot of telescope time for a telescope, JWST. It will answer this question. It can detect molecular oxygen if it is there. So, fingers crossed, in the next 2 years we'll know. But it can only do 1 or 2 planets. That's it. But the point that I'm trying to make is people are looking for biosignatures or what are called biomarkers in the atmospheres of the exoplanets.
Dr. Manoj, we have a question here in YouTube from Dr. Babu PS. He asks that heard of first generation, second generation stars. Is this related to the metallicity?
So that's an interesting question. So it's certainly appeared to be so. So in fact, we are about to submit a paper where we are arguing that it is indeed, this may be the case, that Jupiters did not start forming. Jupiter-like gas giants. So one of the results that we find is that only metal-rich or heavy element-rich stars form Jupiters. So it would look as if Jupiter started forming much later in the history of our galaxy, maybe in the last 5-6 giga years only. So perhaps, yes, it's probably related.
Dr. Sivkumar, any other question in Zoom?
So there is a question in the chat window I see by Aditya Kishore. Why isn't gravitational lensing used much more for discovering exoplanets as compared to radial transiting method? Yeah, that's an interesting question. The reason is because gravitational, I didn't describe what gravitational lensing is, but you typically discover planets which are around stars which are far away from you. So as a result, there is no follow-up observations possible. See, it's not enough to detect a planet, right? You want to measure its mass, its radius, and you want to learn more about them. So with gravitational lensing, you typically detect planets which are far away from us. So follow-up observations are not possible. So that is why that's not the dominant mode as of now.
Yeah. Another question. How can we be sure that planet's own habitable zone has water or water vapors? Shouldn't we be developing new tech to filter out planets with the chance of life?
Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. See, there is something one can do called spectroscopy. I hope you all understand spectroscopy. This is a very powerful tool. So what happens when you so you can see me, right? So the star is here, planet is here, and you are the observer. When the planet is in front of the star, and let's say, imagine now planet has an atmosphere. The starlight will pass through the atmosphere of the planet before it reaches you. If you can spectroscopically analyze that data, you can see the characteristic lines of the species, the material in the planet's atmosphere. And there are certain molecules which we consider, which we think, which we believe are the markers of life. It's like, for instance, Earth's atmosphere, there's methane and there is phosphine. So you probably all have seen this news last month about the detection of, or tentative detection of phosphine in the atmosphere, upper layers of Venus's atmosphere. Phosphine, on Earth, phosphine is produced by life. We produce this industrially, but and anaerobic bacteria also produce this. So such molecules which can only be produced by life are called biosignatures or biomarkers. That is all we can detect now. So if you find any such thing in the atmosphere of exoplanet, we can say that possibly there is life there, but you need to confirm. So we are just beginning to answer this question.
Dr. Sivkumar?
I can look at the chat window. So,
Yeah.
All about life. So I think. So there is a question about the phosphine detection. So, So the importance of that discovery is that, see, there is no other. So on Earth, this is what happens. So phosphine is produced by either by us, industrial production. That's very trace amounts. But on Jupiter, on Venus's atmosphere, we found 1,000 times more phosphine than that is on Earth's atmosphere. Venus atmosphere is very harsh. It's conditions. It's about 700 Kelvin temperature and all that. So there's no way any known chemical, geochemical, or other photochemical reaction can produce phosphine in the atmosphere of Jupiter, Venusian atmosphere. The only mechanism that we know of can produce such phosphine is this anaerobic bacteria, which can produce phosphine. So that is why the detection became very important and newsworthy, because if true, that indicates that Venus's upper decks, about 50 kilometers into the atmosphere, it can host life in the forms of anaerobic bacteria. So that is why that was the newsworthiness of that detection. So there's a question about planetary system with that gravitational waves. No, so we don't have that kind of sensitivity. How is the atmosphere detected on other exoplanets from Earth itself? I just explained it to you, right? If you have a transiting planet, when that planet is crossing that particular star, and you are there, and that starlight will pass through the atmosphere of the exoplanet. So, and if you can analyze that light, it's a very challenging. You need extremely sensitive instruments. I think the next generation telescopes and instruments will certainly do that. There is a question about bigger stars formation. Yeah, so a part of the answer is that see, when it's not bigger dust. So star formation. So maybe I can just show you. See, this is how we think stars form. The collapse of a cloud, and then you form a disk. That is because of angular momentum conservation. The cloud that collapses, it also has some initial rotation. It rotates. So when a rotating cloud collapses, it flattens. So it forms a disk. It is in this disk that planetary systems form. These disks are called protoplanetary disks. So these disks are more massive around more massive stars. So this is one explanation for why more massive planets are formed around massive stars, but not the entire explanation. But here is an image of such a disk from a very powerful telescope. The starlight is blocked here. You actually see a planet being formed in such a disk. And here is another example. So these gaps that you see in this disk, the Jupiter-like planets are being formed, and they are carving out gaps within this disk. And we have now detected several such disks around these are newly formed stars, and the planets are only being formed. See, our sun is 4.5 billion years old. These are a few million years old things. So planets are only being formed. The disk material is still there. So you see the rings and gaps and the holes in this. So these we believe are mostly you have already formed a Jupiter-like planet is forming, and it's moving around. It's carving cavities within the disk. Yeah. So to answer that question, yes, that is what we think is happening.
There is one more question in the chat window.
How do we know about a planetary system lying in a perpendicular plane such that neither can we see the transit nor oh, you mean the phase-on geometry? We cannot. You cannot measure the transit nor the radial velocity, because the velocity, the Doppler shift has to be in your line of sight to detect the plane. You're right. Prashant Kumar is right. So that is a selection effect we have that I discussed. So you will never detect, even if you look at that star for several years, you will not see any transit or anything. Then you cannot really conclude that there is no planet around it. But you can make an estimate. You can correct for that thing. See, there is no reason why all stars and planets should be in the orbital plane should be like that, in that geometry. They'll be randomly distributed, but one can mathematically formulate what fraction we would miss out and account for it or factor that in. And that is what we do when we compute this occurrence rate. We correct for that bias or the observational selection effect.
Okay, hope the questions are all answered. I would like to thank Dr. Manoj Puravankara for his wonderful talk.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for this opportunity.
Once again from the Breakthrough Science Society Kerala chapter. Hope to meet you again and again. And thank you all for have patiently listened to this. Thank you very much, sir.
Yeah. I'm sorry about the breakage in between. So the internet was.
Yeah, these are all.
Flaky.
We can't.
Sorry.
It's out of our control.
Yeah, I wasn't expecting.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and patience for all the people who have joined. And I'm sorry once again about that.
All right. Thank you, Doctor.
Yep.
It's okay. Thank
It's
you.
okay, sir. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you all.